Hi there, this is Paul Lucas with Jumpstart Nature Photography. Today we're going to be covering part 5. Actually, I'm going to sneak in a little coverage of camera, but the kind of the focus a little bit here is on lens and the craft of photography. And as always, quick introduction, you can see my work at paullucasphotography.com. I'm happy to come speak at your organization for no charge, or I'm available for hire for classes and workshops. If you'd like a copy of the Jumpstart Nature Photography presentations, or you have any questions, please drop me an email at paul@jumpstartnaturephotography.com. And as always, I encourage you to participate in our YouTube online constructive critiques of your work. Please drop me an email if you have more questions, paul@jumpstartnaturephotography.com. So we're still, the goals of the course is 3 high-level objectives to cover the craft of photography, so we understand how our cameras affect our aesthetic or art creation, composition, and creative use of light. So we're still in the craft of photography. And in the craft of photography, we've covered the exposure triangle. We're in the camera and lens section. And then the next presentation in the craft segment is just some miscellaneous topics. So the craft of photography, we're going to talk a little bit about cameras and lenses. So it's a gear discussion for all you gearheads. One of the key things is to remember the photographer is the most important piece of equipment. The camera does not know how to take a photograph. So I've heard stories about photographers being at parties and a person comes up and they have seen this wonderful photograph and they say, "You must have some really excellent lenses." And the photographer, knowing that the person at the party made dinner, they say, "You must have some really great dinnerware." It's not the photographer, it's the equipment. And the point of the craft is understanding your equipment. Whether you're using an iPhone or sophisticated DSLR or mirrorless camera with interchangeable lenses, it's important you understand what you can do with the equipment, how the equipment works in different situations and conditions, and that helps you to create the best vision, the best composition, the best art within your photography. So real quickly, typically, the most useful cameras today, so there's a wide range of camera options, are the DSLR, or if you're doing film, an SLR, or a mirrorless camera. So there's lots of options. This is just one little short discussion and one viewpoint. Wide range of camera options and brands, wide ranges of lenses from fisheye or wide angle at one end all the way to very high telephoto lenses. But the nice thing about a DSLR or mirrorless camera is they have a viewfinder. I personally still like using viewfinders. I don't find, if you're working in bright light, you can cup your eye, you can wear a photographer's hood or cloth and get a better sense of the composition through the viewfinder. More of what you see is what you're going to get. If you're using a DSLR, you're just really looking at the scene, but you can see how it's going to be composed. With electronic viewfinders, you even get closer to understanding what the end result is going to look like. But you can always look at the back of your camera, right, and see what the photograph is going to look. A depth of field preview button is often very helpful in understanding your depth of field. Through a traditional mirrored reflex camera, the depth of field preview, getting used to that takes a little bit of practice, but often very useful to understand the depth of field. Because when you look through your DSLR, for example, or your mirrorless camera, I don't use mirrorless camera, so I can't quite say I'm totally familiar with how their depth of field preview will work. But in a DSLR, the lens is set at the widest aperture always, because that gives us the brightest amount of light coming through there. So the depth of preview is going to stop down your lens and it becomes very dark, so you have to let your eye adjust, etc. You want a camera where you have complete manual control, meaning I can set aperture, I can set my aperture, my shutter speed, I can set my ISO settings, right? I can control it. It's handy to have a variety of metering options. You'll mainly in landscape and nature photography, we're going to use matrix metering or evaluative metering or multi-metering, depending on that. They all have slightly different names, but they do the same thing. And as I mentioned, metering options like matrix, center weighted, and spot metering. For the vast majority of landscape photography, we're going to use what's called matrix in Nikon, evaluative metering in Canon, and multi in Sony. For DSLRs, digital single lens reflex cameras, there's a mirror in there that reflects the image up through the viewfinder. So you'll only find this feature on the prosumer to professional level DSLRs is a mirror lockup. And what that does is when the shutter is released, the mirror moves out of the way of the sensor and the shutter is open for whatever the length of speed is, and then the mirror falls back down. So in the process of the mirror moving out of the way, it goes up into the pentaprism, it makes a little bit of a vibration. So to minimize that vibration, because any vibration is an enemy to sharp focus in our camera, any movement, you can lock up the mirror before you take the picture. So you would turn on mirror lockup, you'd hit your shutter release once, you hear the mirror go up, you hit it again, and the shutter takes a photograph and the mirror comes back down. Other useful features are bracketing. If you want to do exposure bracketing, you can do aperture bracketing. You can do all kinds of bracketing, and that's handy, especially if you're interested in high dynamic range photography. Then having some sort of automatic bracketing is handy. Also, live view, that gives you the ability to look at the back of the image if you're using a DSLR, the back of the camera to see the actual live view. It gives you more focusing point options as well. How do you get the most out of your camera? Read the manual. You don't have to necessarily read it from front to back, but you got to make sure you've read the topics that are important to you and some of the basic setup stuff. I always encourage folks to bring their manual with you. And if you're carrying a smartphone or a tablet or some other handheld device, you can download a copy PDF of the camera manual. So I'd say keep it with you. So how do you get the most out of your camera? Read the manual, at least read the important, read some of the parts on, like how does the metering work? How do I set aperture priority? How do I set my ISO to 100, etc. And then practice. Go out and shoot everything. I mean, the more you shoot, the more you'll see how things turn out. And it'll help your compositional eye. Don't get frustrated with some of the images you have. I mean, it's a learning experience, right? Change shutter speed, change aperture opening, change ISO. Try all those different things to see. Try different angles and positions and focal lengths. Just shoot anything. Shoot a chair on your deck in the backyard. Shoot a flower in your garden, whatever. Just to kind of see what happens. Don't be discouraged by the results, because we're going to talk about things in composition to help improve those results. And we'll talk about in this segment lens and how that affects your aesthetic vision. Focal length determines. So we're going to switch to lens now. So the focal length determines what we call the expanse, how far things are pushed away, or the compression of the elements in a picture. And we'll see an example coming up here in a second. Or it minifies or magnifies. There's two aspects to the lens, right? There's the angle of view, so that's how far left and right you see. So like humans have a huge angle of view, 180 degrees or maybe even more. And also how much I said as it expands and compresses. Expands or compresses the elements in the picture. And we'll see what that means in a second. So a 50 millimeter lens in a DSLR, in a full frame DSLR, is considered a normal lens. What does that mean? Generally, that is pretty close to what the human eye perceives as expansion or compression for elements in the image. So that doesn't push things. A wide angle lens pushes things farther away, and a telephoto brings them in and compresses them. So generally speaking, things that are less than 50 millimeters, so 35, 28, 24, 17 are wide angle lens. A fisheye lens, you've seen that where it gives that kind of curve things, or like 8 millimeter, 10 to 8 millimeters in those range. Lenses that are greater than 50 millimeters, 70, 100, 135, 200, etc., are telephoto lens. So wide angle lens will expand the elements, push them away from us. Telephoto will compress it. Now the angle of view in a wide angle lens gets wider, of course. And in a telephoto lens, it gets narrower and narrower. So a 50 millimeter lens is not going to give you the same angle of view as your eye, as the human eye, but it does give you the same kind of sense of depth, how far things are away from you. And if you have a different kind of camera, so there's all kinds of cameras that have interchangeable lens. There's 4/3 cameras. There's what's called crop sensor, APS, APS-C. They will have a different ratio. The lens will always might say 50 millimeter on the outside, at least for traditional APS. Canon, Sony, Nikon all make APS sensors of a sort. They're smaller in size than a full frame. A full frame simply means it's the same size as a 35 millimeter negative. They will have a multiplication ratio. So for Nikon, it's very easy, and I'll use that as an example. If you took a lens that said 50 millimeter on it from Nikon and put it on your DX, so Nikon full frame are FX cameras, and DX cameras are the APS sensor. So they have a 1.5 multiplication ratio, and your 50 millimeter lens actually looks like a 75 millimeter lens that you would use on a full frame camera. So if you want to get the same effect of expansion or slash compression on a 50 millimeter lens on a APS camera, you would probably buy a 35 millimeter lens, a DX 35 millimeter lens, or you would get a 35 millimeter DX lens, right? That would give you the equivalent of a full frame 50 millimeter, or you could buy a 35 millimeter FX lens. So I know this is all very confusing. If you have questions, send them to me. I can send you some web links that explain this, or do a separate segment completely on different size sensors. So you just have to remember, if you're using something other than a full frame DSLR, there's a multiplication ratio. You have to think of that. And often the newer cameras will tell you the equivalent 35 millimeter. Even the point and shoots will now tell you the equivalent 35 millimeter. All right. So what does this mean? So here we are. We have a photograph. My goal in this photograph is this tree on the left. I try to keep it in the same position, the trunk of it in the same position in each of these photographs. So in these photographs, it's of interest to see what I use for my exposure triangle setting, my exposure setting. But the key thing in these is to notice the focal length I'm using. And I used I used a couple lenses in this. I used a 24 to 70 and a 70 to 200, if I recall correctly. So the other thing in this set of photographs of the same basic composition is I had to move back, right? Because I'm a telephoto lens. As I started zooming in on the telephoto side, the lens is magnifying things, right? So when I magnify things to keep that tree in the same position in the frame, I have to move backwards. So here's 24 millimeters. I had a zoom lens, so the zoom, there's not a marking exactly for 50, so I guessed it was actually in the camera when it came out, 48 millimeters. So just looking at the difference between these two, look at, there's a bell tower in the distance. There's a set of water lily kind of flowers growing in the pond there, the lake. And notice how they start to come in. Just going from 24 to 48, it's zooming, it's compressing the scene, meaning the elements in the back are getting closer to us, right? And notice how it compresses, some of the plants in the foreground even, right? The hedge looks a little bit narrower. And the angle of view, not too much difference. We've lost some trees on the right. Okay, now we're going to go from 48. So this is kind of a normal. This is what your eye would typically see. We're going to go to a 70 millimeter, very small telephoto. And look how we've lost some additional, the angle of view's gotten narrower, right? But notice how the elements in the background are getting closer and closer to you. It's compressing the scene, right? So if we go from 70 to 48, it expands, right? It's expanding the scene. If we go from a lower number to a higher number, we're compressing the scene. And look how things are getting closer together. And we'll go one more to a 135 millimeter. Now you can see I've backed up quite a bit. In fact, I couldn't back. I would have liked to take a 200 millimeter shot. I couldn't have done that because I would have had to stand in some bushes. So you can see, though, just going kind of roughly doubling our focal length every time, how it compresses that. So I've tried to keep the tree somewhat similar sized and location in the frame. And as you see, as we go from a wide angle to a normal to a very medium telephoto to a bigger telephoto, you can see how it brings up all that information and compresses it. So that is one of the key aesthetics things you need to understand in the craft of photography, how the effect is of the focal length on your composition. If that tree on the left was my compositional element, what do I want the rest of the photograph to look like? Do I like this composition with a lot of sky? Is that interesting to me? Or is my goal to get some of that background information? So that's a key thing. Also, as I mentioned, in the photo, you can see the light changed a little bit. Here, I'll go back. So generally, I kept it at f16, ISO 100. I was able to keep a pretty good shutter speed. It wasn't too windy that day, so I didn't. And I was shooting on a tripod with a remote release, as you can see as we go through. Finally, as I got to the last one, we came to 1/25th of a second. So the lighting conditions probably changed slightly. There's a little bit less light, so I had to leave the shutter slightly open, slightly more. The other thing to understand, and we'll look at this in another composition photograph, is how the effect of the aperture setting on the photographs are. And this one I wanted as much, a really good depth of focus or depth of field, right? Things in the foreground to things in the background in focus. And so I kept it at f16. If I wanted to just isolate that tree and throw the background out of focus, then I would have used a wider f-stop, f4, f2.8, whatever my camera might be. And then depending, on the focal length, so if I was shooting at 135, I might actually use an f5.6 because I have a very narrow depth of field. The focal length and closeness to your subject changes how the depth of field is affected. All right, so why should I use a wide angle lens? For scenics, tight places, you need a large depth of field. Generally speaking, you're going to get the greatest depth of field with a wide angle lens. So here I shot this with a 26 millimeter setting and f16 to get a good depth of field. And this was a very tight space, standing at the Chicago Botanic Garden on the bridge, and there's objects to my right and left that would compromise the composition. When should I use a telephoto? Well, if I want to bring things in the background closer to me, if I want to make my subject bigger, if I want to have the background thrown out of focus, fuzz the background, or isolate an item in the scene, then I might use a telephoto lens. So here's an example of a very specialized telephoto lens called a macro lens. And a macro lens allows you to get closer to your subject when you're in a telephoto. So the optics are designed to allow you to get closer. So in this photograph, I'm probably less than a foot away. I don't recall the distance, but in a traditional telephoto at 105, I might have to be several feet back. So a macro lens is a specialized type of telephoto lens. But the point here is to illustrate how by bringing in my subject closer, I can throw the background out of focus. And so I'm focusing on the front edge of the center of the flower. I'm using f5.6. This lens goes to 2.8, but f5.6 gave me enough focus around the flower. I wasn't trying to get every petal in focus. That was not my aesthetic objective or my vision objective for this photograph, but to get the center of the flower in focus and then throw the background completely out. And I was able to do that with the macro lens. You can often do that with your telephoto lens. We'll talk about that or see some examples in upcoming segments. So that's kind of the discussion around the lens. The last thing, I guess, zoom versus prime lenses. Prime lenses, the difference is a prime lens is fixed at a particular focal length. So you buy like a 24 millimeter, a 35, a 50, a 70, a 100, a 200 lens. So they are fixed at a particular focal length. Often, prime lenses have, it's less expensive to buy them often, and they're very sharp. And you can often get lenses that have a wider aperture setting, which is cool sometimes. But you do change. I'm kind of going backwards here, I know. You do carry more lenses, and you have to change them. Zoom lenses, you might only need to carry 2 or even 1 potentially, depending on what you're trying to do in your photography. But the zooms have gotten very, very good. So the zooms, it's hard really to see the difference in sharpness often between a good zoom and a prime lens. They're more expensive individually, but you're not buying as many, right? You carry maybe 2, but they are also heavier. And if you want a lens that has a fixed aperture on the widest open end, the 2.8 or f4, they are much more expensive. So if you start out in kind of a consumer grade, a good lens, it's a good sharp lens, but less expensive, you'll see it has a variable aperture opening. So you might buy a 70 to 200. It might say f3.5 to 5.6, and that is the aperture. The widest the aperture will open, it varies depending on the focal length. At the widest focal length at 70, you might have an f5.6. At the telephoto end, the widest aperture opening might be f5.6. If you want to get a camera that has, say, a fixed aperture across the entire zoom range of f4, it's going to be more expensive. That's kind of in the prosumer line. If you want one that's a 2.8, which would be towards the pro line, then it's even more expensive. And those lenses are not only more expensive to design the optics and have all the glass needed to do that, but they're also bigger and heavier. So just some thoughts. Things are still in change. Mirrorless cameras are, an interesting future direction of cameras. I think DSLRs will, in my opinion, eventually go away. But the lenses are not going to change. If you want a 70 to 200 f2.8 zoom lens, you cannot get away with the physics of designing that. So you're going to still need the same amount of glass. So you might save weight on the body, but of the camera, the camera body, but the lens will probably be, unless they make it all plastic, which we don't want, would be probably just as large and heavy, or would be just as large and heavy as a traditional DSLR lens. So I think that is the end. If you have any questions, please drop me an email, paul@jumpstartnaturephotography.com, and I look forward to seeing you in the next segment. Thanks.